I wanted to take the opportunity to welcome all of you on behalf of the Bureau of Justice Assistance to the Project Safe Neighborhoods Fiscal Year 2020 Grant Program Solicitation webinar. We want to thank you all for joining us today, particularly in light of the current situation with COVID-19. Thank you for all that you do to keep our communities safe. This webinar will provide details and guidance to eligible applicants on the Fiscal Year 2020 PSN Block Grant Program. Prior to beginning today's webinar, please allow us to make a few other comments. Please place your phone on mute and not on hold during the presentation. To see the WebEx features, hover your mouse over the bottom center of the screen to see the chat and media viewer icons. If you have difficulty hearing the audio, which I hope you can now, please click on Communicate on the top left and then the audio connection to adjust your speakers. If you still have difficulty hearing, dial in using the call-in information in your WebEx meeting invite. If you need technical assistance, please feel free to reach out to the host using the chat function. We will answer questions at the end of the webinar presentation. However, we encourage you to make your thoughts and questions known during the webinar using the chat utility. This webinar is being recorded for the benefit of others who may wish to view it later and will be posted on the PSN TTA website. It'll be captioned for the deaf and hard of hearing. Following the webinar, you will receive a request to evaluate it. Please complete the evaluation and give us your honest thoughts and recommendations. Now on to today's webinar. Our speakers include Kate McNamee, Senior Policy Advisor at the Bureau of Justice Assistance, Stephen Fender, Senior Policy Advisor at BJA, and Brandy Donini-Mendelson, Program Manager at the Executive Office for United States Attorneys. To begin, I'll pass it over to Kate McNamee. Kate?
Thank you very much, Juliana. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kate McNamee, as Juliana previously said. I am a Senior Policy Advisor at BJA with oversight over PSN. And our goal today is to provide you with the information you need to apply for the 2020 PSN funding in support of your PSN team's violence reduction strategy. Steve and I will provide an overview of the FY 2020 program along with its purpose, goals, and objectives for those of you who are new, discuss eligibility requirements, provide guidance on the funding allocation your district should plan for as you put your application together, the different application sections you should be aware of, as well as resources available to you as you develop your submission. And then Brandy will provide some answers to frequently asked questions from the EOUSA perspective. And then we will open it up to general Q&A. Lots to cover, so let's get started. Next slide, please. PSN has been around since 2001, and it is designed to reduce violent crime through facilitating coordination and cooperation among federal, state, tribal, and local law enforcement entities. This PSN team is led by the local U.S. Attorney's Office and implements 5 key design features. Leadership by the U.S. Attorney of the PSN team and the development of the PSN strategy, partnerships with law enforcement, public health, community service agencies, and citizen groups to formulate a comprehensive violence reduction approach, a laser focus on the relatively small number of people and places driving violent crime in a given community, engaging in prevention activities to prevent further violence, and maintaining accountability for results through the collection of performance data. PSN's objectives are to put effective programs and strategies in place that reduce violent crime, to encourage the use of intelligence and data to identify crime drivers, as well as to create and maintain functional and productive partnerships among federal, state, tribal, and local law enforcement officials. Eligible applicants are outlined here, and of important note is all fiscal agents applying must be certified by the relevant district United States Attorney's Office. Fiscal agents may be states, units of local government, educational institutions, faith-based and other community organizations, private nonprofit organizations, and federally recognized Indian tribal governments. And for details on the responsibilities of a fiscal agent, please see pages 5 to 6 of the solicitation. You can also find information on the fiscal agent certification process on the BJ PSN program website, and we will post a link in the chat box for your reference. BJ recommends that districts select their current PSN fiscal agent or consider using the state administering agency where appropriate. But also, just to reiterate, if an applicant is a fiscal agent and has not received the required certification by the local USAO, the application will not be considered for funding. So it is a crucial step in your application process. The solicitation was posted on March 31st, 2020, and it is scheduled to close on June 1st. So at this point in time, that close date is firm and will allow a 60-day open period. If you are encountering issues related to COVID-19 in regards to meeting that deadline as it draws closer, please do report that to BJA, and we will consider those on a case-by-case basis. But at this point, that deadline is firm. BJA will make awards for project periods of up to 36 months, beginning on October 1st, 2020. Each federal judicial district is eligible to apply for a funding allocation based on its violent crime rate and its population. When developing your FY 2020 strategy and budget, which I know is challenging each year, waiting for that allocation number, this year, please base it on the FY 2019 allocation. We expect to make 93 awards based on the formula, and the link to the FY19 allocations can be found on page 4 of the solicitation. So when the FY20 amounts are finalized, we will work with PSN teams to make any necessary revisions, where and if necessary. And fiscal agents may use up to 10% of the allocation to support the administration of the award, and that has not changed from previous years. And last important point, the authorizing legislation again includes a requirement that 30% of PSN funding be used to support, quote, gang task forces in regions experiencing significant or increased presence of criminal or transnational organizations engaging in high levels of violent crime, firearms offenses, human trafficking, and drug trafficking. We have included a list of FAQs regarding that gang set-aside at Appendix B of the solicitation. So we strongly encourage you to review it and let us know if you have any questions on this requirement. In terms of deliverables, BJ requires periodic progress and financial reports, which are clearly laid out in the special conditions of the grants. Also, if your award supports the activities of a research partner, the team must submit a final report that captures the results of their work, both in terms of their documentation of the program's implementation, as well as its outcomes. And the reason for this is that this helps us share lessons learned and promising practices with other members of the PSN community and the law enforcement community at large. And I can hear sighs of relief and perhaps some celebration from the audience, even though you're silent. No action plan will be required for awards made in 2020, so that requirement has been removed from the program. So this list of required application elements is listed in the appendices and within the solicitation itself. And all of these documents are due by the deadline listed in the solicitation. And I want to highlight the importance of the additional attachments with special emphasis on the certification, again, certification letter from the local U.S. attorney. And we really, truly cannot move forward without that certification. We do require an abstract that allows us a snapshot of your PSN grant strategy, the target enforcement area, and any key partners, research partners or otherwise. And we use this as part of the award recommendation process and documentation. And the program narrative, very important, but it has been streamlined this year and is detailed on pages 9 to 10 of the solicitation. Please use these questions as a guide for putting your narrative together. And please do document how you plan to use the gang task force set aside. And now I'll turn it over to Steve to discuss the budget and other requirements.
Thanks, Kate. This slide covers what you need to know about submitting your budget documents. For 2020, please use the form linked in the solicitation and list all costs in the appropriate budget category. You'll see the links here in the slide, but they're also in the solicitation. If your non-federal, non-conflicted selection committee makes funding decisions before the application deadline, you can include the specifics in your budget. If not, an estimate of administrative funds and future subaward costs will serve for budget approval. As in previous years, specific subaward budget costs will be reviewed prior to authorization. Importantly, in determining your 2020 award amounts for the budget and application, please refer to the 2019 allocations, as mentioned, that are posted in the link you see here. The appropriation for 2020 is the same as it will be in 19, so it'll be very close. It'll be a very close estimate for the final 2020 formula amount that your district will be allocated, and those final numbers will be determined at a later date based upon, just as previous years, Part 1 crime of population. We don't yet have the final numbers, and once we get them, we'll have the Bureau of Justice Statistics run the formula, and we'll apply it. And once we have the final numbers, we'll notify you to change the application to the submitted amount. It's our sense that it will be very close given year-to-year differences, historical year-to-year differences. Finally, if you can provide a complete budget, that will greatly streamline approval, but please be prepared to revise your final budget number based on the future allocation. So use the 2019 number for now to apply and for your budget, and then I will be in contact with the person who submits the application to make that change. For BGA grants, it's important to be sure that you understand the difference between subawards and subcontracts. For PSN, most of the funds will be used for subawards, but there may be some contracts to support services for the prime grantee and subawards that you make. To help make the determination, we have detailed guidance that includes subaward versus subcontract checklists that you can use when making the decision. In general, subawards are to achieve programmatic goals of the grant award, and subcontracts are used to fund support services. But please refer to the links there in the checklist for any questions you have. And then when you get post-award, if you have additional questions, please contact me directly. As part of your application, you'll need to submit all subawards to BGA for review and authorization, just like in 19 and 18. With the changes that we made in 19, so you'll see a similar list of documents here. You'll need DHS and ICE responses, both for yourself as the primary applicant at the time of application, and also for all subwards that are state and local governments. We also need a letter of subaward information. This is a summary of the project. You know, it's a note here in the description, legal name, the award amount, and a project summary. Essentially, who's getting the money, how much, and what are they going to do with it, and then finally a budget that should give us detailed information about how funds will be determined and ensure that all costs are allowable. For those of you that have been previous PSN applicants, you should be pretty well aware of the process, and I work together with Kate and to review the costs and then send you approval once complete. And as in previous years, well, the previous 2 years, all subrecipients will will receive approval from BGA, which includes 1373 review of the DHS and ICE responses. One of the things we do find to be a frequent shortcoming with DHS questions, make sure if the subawards answer yes, that the supplemental documentation is also present in what you send over as part of the subaward authorization. Any questions about? We definitely have had some questions about eligibility. I have to or look at those on a case-by-case basis. So if you have any questions regarding subgrantee eligibility based on these or other guidelines, please contact me directly. I think we've done this enough now that we have some sense of it, but in large part, BJA will have to review them and approve them individually. Okay, I mentioned questions earlier, so for any questions you have, feel free to contact Kate, whose information you see on this slide. And for those who don't have it, here's my contact information. I talked to many of our current and previous applicants, but here's my information should you need it. For those that have additional questions, here are a few recommended resources for you. Special attention here is for the DOJ financial guide and the required financial management training for new grantees. If you're a new grantee, or if you have a new point of contact, or you haven't taken the training yourself, you'll need to take the grant's financial management training, which we have linked here. Once you're post-award, you'll enter your grant number to register for the training, and there are a number of modules that you'll need to go through, and then you'll receive a certificate, and we'll need that as evidence of completion. You have 90 days to complete that at the end of once the grant has been made. For any questions that you have while developing your solicitation, please contact the application assistance team at NCJRS. Their servers can provide answers to any general questions you have for this and other BJA grant-related applications. The contact information is provided here for those that need it. And then if you have any specific questions that you can't get answered from this group, feel free to contact myself and I'll do my best to answer the questions that you have. Here's one additional resource slide for those that may be new to submitting BJA grant applications. At this link, you'll find a webinar that provides guidance on how to apply, an overview of the federal funding process, and common mistakes to avoid when submitting an application. Thanks. And I'm now going to turn it over to Brandy at EOUSA, who will provide additional information. Brandy?
Great, thank you. All right, so we're just going to get into some frequently asked questions. And I've received, since I've been the program manager for about a year now, I have received a lot of questions, but these appear to be some of the most common questions that I get. So I'm just going to run through these. And as always, you should always feel free to call me. I can help troubleshoot some of these questions in more detail because it is going to depend largely on your district dynamic. And there may be times where I'm going to need to reach out to Kate and Steve, and then together with you, we can have a conversation about how to troubleshoot some of these, the issues you may be experiencing. So just to start, the first question I get a lot is the U.S. Attorney's Office supposed to have a PSN strategy separate and apart from the grant strategy? And the answer to that is yes, you are. The U.S. Attorney's offices are supposed to have a PSN program strategy, which is different than the PSN grant strategy. However, they should be complementary of one another. So getting back to the PSN program strategy, I would recommend that U.S. Attorney's offices meet at least annually with violent crime reduction partners to review and discuss their program strategy and consider developing a written strategy, which may help you measure the progress of your efforts. And this is an area where Seth Adamanero can be a really fantastic resource for you as well. The PSN program strategy can actually help to inform the PSN grant strategy and associated narrative. I have found in my experience that providing your program strategy can really be save the fiscal agent a lot of work in trying to guess where you're deciding to devote your focus. I would also encourage PSN coordinators, many who are very busy with cases and operations, to really utilize their law enforcement coordinators to help convene partners, which depending on your district can be really challenging as there are really delicate relationship dynamics at play. I know, I've been there. I know that in some districts this can be really challenging. Collaboration, coordination, and strategic planning are key duties of your law enforcement coordinator, so they can be a really fantastic asset to the PSN coordinator. And they can really help you think through when you don't have time how to put the elements of your program strategy together. This next question I get is the U.S. Attorney's Office permitted to write the grant narrative? And I just wanted to recap quickly before I directly answer that question. And that if you looked at slide 14 that Kate referenced, slide 14 made reference to the program narrative for the grant application. This information is also referenced starting on page 9 of the grant solicitation. And so as referenced, the narrative includes the statement of the problem, project design, implementation, gang task force set aside, and then each section provides questions that help respond to the narrative requirements. All right, so that's the grant narrative, just to recap. But back to the original question, is the U.S. Attorney permitted to write the grant program narrative? They are not. No, the U.S. Attorney's Office is not permitted to write the grant program narrative. This is the responsibility of the fiscal agent. The U.S. Attorney can review the program narrative after it's written by the fiscal agent to make sure that it accurately represents the intent of the PSN team. Okay, so what can the U.S. Attorney write? Again, the U.S. Attorney's Office should not write any portion of the grant application, but what it can do is provide the fiscal agent with the written USAO district PSN program strategy. So if you have a written PSN program strategy, again, this is a really useful tool for the fiscal agent. If you do have a written strategy and if the strategy contains sensitive information, you can consider redacting portions of it. Another document that you could consider that could help the fiscal agent write the narrative is the districts will provide EOUSA with a 1 or 2 page overview of your PSN strategy. You could provide that perhaps to the fiscal agent to help you or to help them draft the program, the grant application. But one word of caution about that, and I think this goes back to the point of really assessing these on an annual basis. Before sending documents to your fiscal agent, I just really give a good look to make sure it still reflects the U.S. Attorney's Office and the Project Safe Neighborhoods team focus, because as we all know, crime can shift and the team may decide that it wants to focus on City B as opposed to City A this year. So again, just really important that you're looking at those on an annual basis. And if I know that when I was in Massachusetts, I found it to be a really useful tool to have a strategy, a written program strategy. And I think that it really impacted how quickly the fiscal agent was able to put things together on their end. So the next question is, can you clarify the difference between the PSN team and the selection committee? How does that work in practice? I'll give Kate and Steve an opportunity to talk about this too if I've missed important points. But I just want to break down, like, what do we mean by a PSN team? And that's a little nuanced. And I've had conversations with individuals all across the nation about this. And it really is going to depend on your district. But most importantly, your PSN team should not just be your U.S. Attorney's Office. Although the U.S. Attorney leads the team really should consist of non-U.S. Attorney agency representatives. And the PSN team is really viewed as a collaborative of agency representatives who review the violent crime problem, discuss associated enforcement and prevention strategies. And this team is the one that helps to identify violent crime problems and violent crime reduction goals and objectives for your district. Again, this is really useful to U.S. Attorney's offices because, as many of you know, it's helpful when you don't feel like you're going it alone. And what I have seen a lot of districts rely upon are their representatives from their ATF, their FBI, their DEA, their state and local law enforcement. Those have been fantastic team members. And then we've also seen some that utilize academia and nonprofit organizations. And it's also important to know that your PSN team can be called different things. And you'll notice in this year's solicitation, we really took out and changed the language. It used to be called, we used to reference it as a PSN task force. We've really changed that language to make it more broader, to call a PSN team, because we really recognize that everyone looks at this a little differently based on their dynamics. And so we hope this reframing of that language helps to give you a little more flexibility. Some have actually called their teams task forces, you know, for instance, a PSN task force or maybe a gang task force or domestic violence working group or PSN leadership team or PSN steering committee. We've even seen some U.S. attorneys' offices who will have different subcommittees as a part of their PSN team that focus on different issues. But then the other side is, on the other hand, we also see teams that are really loosely structured, and that's okay too. And by that I mean some districts convene partners to address specific violent crime issues. For instance, you may have regular meetings to discuss gangs or guns or domestic violence concerns in your district. In some districts, you may have existing meetings with law enforcement executives, and then you carve out a time during those meetings to discuss violent crime issues. You know, really, these people are part of the people that are part of the conversations can be your, quote, PSN team. The term has a lot of flexibility, and although, again, the U.S. Attorney leads the team and its perspective is vitally important, the team is absolutely essential to helping inform the district's program strategy and focusing in on specific objectives. Along those lines, your PSN team should also be saying what they want to prioritize for its program strategy. For instance, you may have the team that says, you know, look, we see that there's violent crime in these 5 cities or these 3 cities, but we really need to be focusing on, for this upcoming 3-month, 6-month year, we need to really be prioritizing our focus on city A or maybe city B but not A. And then the team can also say, let's throw some funding at this. Let's say the team says we think we should put a percentage of grant funding to address Objective A. And again, I think this goes back to this level of detailed conversation among the team is so important, because without it, the fiscal agent can't possibly know how to develop the grant narrative, the budget documents, and other application documents. They really are taking direction from the team, and they can't do that if those conversations and that direction isn't provided. This brings me to the next point, which is what is a selection committee or a selection team? And I think the points that I'll make about this is, and this is an area where I think Steve and Kate may have some feedback on, is the selection committee must be non-federal partners. I have seen selection committee members be 3 members or 5 members. I've seen it be an odd number, because if you have 2 that say we're going to go this, we'd like to go this direction, versus 1 that says something else, at least you have a majority. But the selection committee, really using the framework of the PSN team, identifies who gets the money. So this is the who. This is particularly important in situations where a portion of the grant funding will be issued through a competitive subaward process. And I know that, you know, in this particular solicitation, I believe Stephen indicated there's not a competition requirement. But for some PSN teams, depending on your allotment, you may have enough funding to actually use for a prevention program that perhaps you don't really, you really want to make that more of a competitive subaward process, which having a selection committee is going to be really important to help you navigate that, because again, the PSN team is not the decision makers on where the money goes. It's the selection committee that decides who gets it and how much money is going to go to those entities. And again, going back to, although the fiscal agent isn't required to make awards via this year's solicitation, again, having that selection committee in place is going to be really important. I've heard some districts who use their selection committee to actually review subaward applications and then they rank them. And then I've heard some fiscal agents, depending on their structure, particularly like the SAAs, they'll use their own internal peer review team and then provide the results to the selection team. I think it really depends on the district-specific variables, and then I think it also depends on, BJA's guidance that it's providing to those fiscal agents. And so I'm going to stop here and throw it to Kate and Steve to see specifically on that issue. Are there important things that you want to relay relating to selection committee, PSN team?
Well, this is Steve. I mean, from my perspective, we let the districts decide who's going to be part of the selection committee, and I think you hit on the key points. There's no competition. However, the funding decisions need to be made by non-federal and non-conflicted parties. I think we've had a fair number of questions regarding the conflict, but in short, if the people who are making the funding decisions, they should not be up to receive funding. I mean, that's like the basic version of conflict of interest, in my view. If you need us to make an official determination on a possible conflict of interest, we can do that. We just need just something in writing from you that describes the circumstances. Over the years, we've had some different circumstances arise. So, I'd say our first guidance would be non-federal, non-conflicted. And if you have questions about the conflicted piece, you can contact me directly and we'll get a determination from you. But if you have people who aren't receiving the funding, making the funding decisions, that's a pretty good place to start.
Yeah, and I'll just add, I really liked Brandy's depiction of the difference between the program strategy versus the grant strategy. And another way to think of this is the PSN team, those are the people you need at the table to drive your program, your PSN program, your violence reduction strategy, and your PSN selection committee are the ones who are going to drive your grant strategy and select who receives the funding.
So this brings me to the next, actually one more point on this. So I'm anticipating some questions here about ethical concerns of selecting PSN team members and selection committee members. I think that, let me get to one, my experience is U.S. attorneys' offices are going to identify team members based on their understanding of the violent crime problem. You're basing your decisions on data, statistical data, and anecdotal. You can always run this by your ethics advisor if there's a real concern based on your district dynamics. In my experience, I worried more about damaging relationships by not asking a particular entity to be a part of our PSN team. That was a concern that I had. Then you run the risk of impacting relationships and your ability to be effective. So while there are obviously ethical concerns associated with who you are bringing to the table as a part of your PSN team, I think that the relationship dynamic is probably one that's a little more challenging for districts. In terms of your selection committee members, I have seen that my experience is the selection committee members are decided by the PSN team. So the U.S. Attorney's Office is not making those decisions. Again, that is a team decision who is going to be a part of who are going to be the selection committee members. All right, so getting to what role does the U.S. Attorney play in deciding who gets PSN funding? So this really ties back into your program strategy, and I think this can get a little convoluted and nuanced. I'm going to stay away from the nuanced issue because I think that's going to be better handled on a case-by-case basis, and I don't want to step in it and give some guidance to one district that really isn't relevant to another. But what I will say is that the U.S. Attorney leads the PSN team, and like other team members, it helps to craft the PSN program strategy. And again, like other team members, it can say that these are the goals and objectives that the U.S. Attorney's Office thinks should be prioritized with funding support. U.S. attorneys are often really great at starting those discussions and getting people talking. It can also provide feedback related to percentages of funding that should go to specific areas. So the next question on the slide, so it's question, let's see here, does the team need to utilize a research partner? So that's question 5 on the slide. No, actually there's no requirement to utilize a research partner for this particular solicitation. Kate, Steve, did you need to add anything to that?
It is not a requirement. It has always been strongly encouraged because it's just so useful to have a researcher as part of your team, whether they receive grant funding or not, to weigh in on those data issues that really help you zero in on your crime drivers, but it is not required. But if you do want to have a research partner and you require assistance in recruiting one, that is something we deal with the PSN TTA program very often, and we're happy to provide that assistance.
Great. I actually just fielded a call this morning about this issue, and one of the districts is their PSN team is looking at utilizing, they already have their police department, or they have a university that it appears as though they can leverage some of this work. So those are really creative solutions to still being a part of the project, but not necessarily having to devote a funding piece to it. So the next question is question 6. The PSN team wants to include a media outreach component in its strategy. What does the team and the fiscal agent need to be aware of? So this actually came up recently, and EOUSA has issued some guidance on media outreach efforts related to new outreach products. And let me clarify what I mean by outreach products. That's the examples are outreach projects that must be cleared include broadcast materials, television and radio, print and internet materials targeted for widespread distribution, and then other publications financed with PSN grant money and intended to communicate the PSN message. So we have some very specific guidance on that, and U.S. attorneys' offices are asked to consult with EOUSA before producing outreach materials. And then we can, what I'll do is I'll make sure, if you're not already familiar with this document, we'll send you the link. The document can be found on the SharePoint site for U.S. attorneys. And then we have a shorter document that we can send to fiscal agents if it's a part of a strategy, your grant strategy. I also wanted to flag, and this was the issue that came up recently with one of our districts, is if you do decide that you are going to make this a part of your strategy, what I would recommend is that districts, if you're doing this as a part of a sub-award process, that your sub-award process, or if you're doing a competitive solicitation, that you make reference to these requirements. That way your applicants know ahead of time that they're going to have some hoops to jump through. That way they're not frustrated later because they didn't know it. So I would strongly recommend that if that's a part, that you include some of these requirements in there. One thing that's not referenced in the document is live broadcast. And if your strategy, part of your strategy is to utilize funding, grant funding for live broadcast for airtime, we would have to run that by the department's Office of Public Affairs. There's ways that I'm sure we can manage that, but it's definitely one of those things where I want to flag it as live broadcast is going to be something that where you're going to need to put in place a lot of pre-meets. How are you going to handle the pre-meets before the live broadcast? What's the marching orders going to be on who's going to be featured in the live broadcast? So there's a lot of, I'm not saying that it can't be done. I'm just suggesting that if that's a part of your strategy, then you should definitely reach out to me, and then we can talk through what might be useful in proactively communicating that to applicants or sub-awardees. All right, so question 7, before it files the application, can the fiscal agent provide the U.S. Attorney's Office and the PSN team the draft grant narrative to ensure that it represents the intent of the PSN team? Yes. The U.S. Attorney and the PSN team can review the grant narrative to make sure it represents the intent of the focus of the PSN team. So that's definitely, you're not writing the grant, it's being written, and you're making sure that it's consistent. There's not an ethical challenge and a prohibition of that, particularly with this type of a grant. The last question is, the current fiscal agent doesn't want to continue being the fiscal agent in 2020. What does the U.S. Attorney do next? For those where this applies, I hope that this doesn't apply. I know that I'm delusional in thinking that it doesn't apply, but I know that this can produce a great deal of anxiety for districts, particularly if your allocation is not very large. If this is you, I think the guidance is reach out to EOUSA. Ultimately, the PSN team will need to approve a new fiscal agent. But the U.S. Attorney can help identify that entity, because that's my experience. That's usually where it starts, is the U.S. Attorney sort of comes up with some options and throws it to the PSN team to sort of decide. The U.S. Attorney, as Steve had mentioned, that they will need to certify the fiscal agent and to provide the letter. But then the bigger question that I get is, if there's no one in your district that is willing to be the fiscal agent, again, please reach out to me. The sooner the better. And together with BJA, with Steve and Kate, we can help you troubleshoot it. I know that this is a very stressful experience for a lot of U.S. Attorneys' offices. And I really feel for you when you're in this particular situation, and particularly when your U.S. Attorney is saying that we want to make sure that we don't lose the funding. So I hear you. I'm here to support you. I know BJA is going to work with you to try to help you troubleshoot this. So please feel free to reach out to us if you need help with that. And so that's it for the questions that I have. If you want to go to the next slide. That's it. That's my contact. Most of you already know me.
All right. Thank you, Brandy. Well, we have received a number of questions from participants via the chat function. And the first one deals directly with that issue you were just addressing, Brandy. Someone was wondering if a member of the PSN team can serve as a fiscal agent.
So I would say yes. And Steve and Kate, for instance, if you have a police department who is on your team, right? You have a police department, and the Metro PD, for instance, in DC is on your PSN team. Can they be the fiscal agent, and can they also receive the funds? I'll throw that to Kate and Steve. That's definitely in their lane, because I know there are some special situations involving that.
Well, from my perspective, yes. As long as they're an eligible entity, they can serve as a fiscal agent. We have a number of police departments that are fiscal agents in previous years. So, yeah, that's fine. The next question is, in terms of whether they receive all the programmatic funding or a portion of the programmatic funding, regardless of who the fiscal agent is, funding decisions still need to be made by the non-federal, non-conflicted selection committee, with some exceptions that we have. That those who received money in the past directly we can consider. So we have some instances where within the target area only one entity can perform the service, and typically that falls into the government entity and police department. So we do have some exceptions that our general counsel's office reviews and approves. That's a long answer to the question, but ultimately, yes, a law enforcement agency could be the fiscal agent. Typically, I like to see the city be the fiscal agent in place of that, because they have a much longer tenured grant management office, but it is definitely an eligible entity.
And I would like to add that it's actually helpful to have your fiscal agent looped into what the team is doing. If they're a formal member of the PSN team, or you just keep them up to speed on a regular basis, your POC at the fiscal agent. If they're not a member of the team, it tends to help things move more smoothly on the grant administration and reporting end, as well as when you apply for funds each year.
Thank Thank you. This next question also relates to selection committees. So you spoke about how the U.S. Attorney are in the discussion of where the district money might go. So this individual has 4 separate PSN teams, 1 in each of their divisions, and had put together a district-wide committee to divide up funding between their districts. And so they're wondering if they are hoping to not have to divide funding equally between divisions. And they ask, do we still have to use this Uber committee to decide where within the district we can spend the money?
Well, I think there's a lot going on there, but I'm not totally sure what the question is. I think the question is, do you need to use a larger committee to make the funding decisions across the district where you may have multiple target areas? Yeah, I think we have to sort of manage that on a case-by-case basis. Ultimately, you know, it really complicates things. We've seen some challenges when we have multiple committees making funding decisions across one district. It'd be my recommendation, and I see it as a best practice, to have one committee, look at the selections, understand the priorities within your target areas, and have representatives from across the district. That'd be my recommendation for a best practice, because it streamlines the funding review and process and it limits complexity. I don't think we necessarily require that, but what I've seen in districts that have multiple selection committees across one district, it really slows down funding and it complicates matters in previous years. So my recommendation is the former, but I don't think we specifically prohibit the latter at this time.
Yeah, so the clarification that we received on this was, do we need an umbrella committee to decide how much each division gets? And it sounds like you've answered that, Steve. So
okay.
The next question that we got was related to the 30% set aside. Someone was asking, why was that continued this year?
The reason it was continued is that we had a 2-year authorization passed in 2018, I believe, and so we are beholden to that. We were hoping for a legislative fix that would have altered that requirement, but that fix unfortunately did not happen. So we are still required to set aside that 30% for that purpose.
Thank you, Kate. So another question, I think this one would be directed at Steve. For the letters of subawards, are the subawards listed on the fiscal agent letterhead or separately on the individual subgrantee letterhead?
Well, you can, it doesn't matter. What we need to see is that you have a proposal, the selection committee has approved the proposals, and it has the required information that we discussed in the slides. You know, I work with whatever you have. Typically, we see a fiscal agent documents that includes all the relevant information, like an application that comes from the fiscal agent that requests all the pertinent information as part of the application. But you know, it doesn't matter. Ultimately, we will, as long as you have what's required, we're glad to review it.
Okay, another question that someone had about research partners, is there a kind of a typical amount that they receive from the grant funding as a subaward?
I'm going to jump in and unhelpfully say it depends. It depends on how extensive you want their involvement to be. Do you just want them to spend some time with you and the team identifying your crime drivers, or is it a more involved role where they're doing a full-blown process and outcome evaluation of your PSN strategy? In the past, years past, when we've had programs that have used research partners or required research partners, we ask that 20% of the grant award be devoted to research partners, but of course those were $700,000 awards. Those were designed to be extremely rigorously evaluated programs. So it really does depend. You can spend $10,000, you can spend $30,000, you can spend $300,000, depending on what you want your research partner to do for you.
Okay, thank you, Kate. Another question that we received was, does the selection committee have input to the distribution of funds if you have multiple grantees?
I'm not sure I understand that. I think I would probably want clarification because your selection committee is supposed to be deciding your grantees.
Yeah, your subaward recipients. Yeah.
Yeah, right. Your subaward recipients.
Okay, thank you. Our next question is, do the subawards need to be determined for the grant application, or can those be determined afterward?
You could, if you have them determined in advance, I think that's great. If BJA will still need to review and authorize each one post-award because of the 1373 requirements. We have to get those reviewed and approved at a level beyond myself and Kate. So you can please, I mean, in my view, the earlier you determine them, the better. And the more likely your submitted budget will represent the actual cost, which is streamlined things. So if you've already decided or you want to fund a previous existing program, that sounds great. And I'll work with you post-award to get the sub-award authorized and that way and to fund the project as soon as we can.
All right. We have received questions about the recording and the slides. We'll make those available on the PSN PTA website and also send out both the recording and the slides to everyone who attended today. So,
Julianne, I had one question that I got via text by somebody who had to jump off. They wanted to know about the sole sourcing. Did that come up? I don't believe that came up, so I thought that might be an important question that we cover, sole source. Steve, is that something that you're prepared to comment on now, or is that an individual case-by-case situation?
Brandy, I'm always ready to talk about non-competitive procurement. And as it relates to the PSN program, since we don't have a competition requirement for PSN for 2020, really it's only relevant for services. So I'm glad you asked the question because this is an area of confusion. So as it relates to non-competitive procurement as overseen by the Code of Federal Regulation, that only applies to contracts. So, and since we make subawards to the PSN model, I think it won't apply. But I think the question goes back to our fiscal agent receiving money and then having that funding decision made independently to avoid conflict of interest for the fiscal agent to receive funds. So that is, I think for 2020, as long as the selection committee is making the funding decision and you don't have a conflict of interest for those that are making the fund decision, the fiscal agent could receive programmatic funding. I believe that's I think that's a question that was being asked. We've had some back and forth on the competition, but for 2018, but without the competition for 2020, that shouldn't be an issue. I think the best thing for you to do is if post-award or at any time really, please contact me directly in those instances so I can give you a clear answer for your grant. And the most important thing as it relates to grant administration for BJA is that you document and memorialize all thinking that informs your decision. So, and by that I mean, make sure you contact BJA and have it on record what exactly the decision is and maintain that in your grant file for future review.
Thanks, Steve. We have received a couple additional questions in the last couple minutes. So the first one is for 2020, does the selection committee still need to exist since there is no competition requirement, or can the decision be made by the PSN team?
So I'll take that one. You still need to have a non-federal, non-conflicted selection committee for all grant funding decisions. So no one with a conflict of interest and no federal employees can make funding decisions for the PSN model. So you will need a selection committee, and that could be a subset of your PSN team that represent the previously mentioned characteristics of non-federal and non-conflicted.
All right, and then there was a question of clarification that came through. I want to make certain that I heard correctly that for all fiscal year 18 subawards, BJA must approve the recipient. I'm not sure if they meant 20 there, but.
Well, for 18, 19, and 20 subawards require authorization from BJA, yes.
All right, well thank you, Steve. Thank you, Kate and Brandy. Kate, did you have any closing comments to make prior to concluding the webinar?
Just that we're always here to answer your questions, and we hope that everybody stays safe and healthy in the current circumstances, and we look forward to working with you to make your FY2020 funding as pain-free as possible, and so that you can use it to support violence reduction in your communities.
Well, thank you, Kate, and thank you everyone for joining us today and for bearing with our technical difficulties. We really appreciate it. Have a good afternoon.